Well, welcome to our podcast. This is another episode of Stay Classy San Diego, sponsored by MaxLux Media, with your host being myself, Steve Wire, a freelance reporter affiliated with the Coast News, the North Coast Current, among other organizations. It's also sponsored by Barntime, and you can check out their productions at barntimemusic.com. Today we have three guests. We have sitting in the middle, Marco Gonzalez. On the right, we have Molly Drake Woods. Woods Drake, excuse me. And then on the left, we have Garvin Walsh. And I'd just like to go around and make some introductions. So Marco is a co-founder and he's a managing partner at Coast Law Group, LLP, where he oversees the firm's environmental and land use, government relations, and election law practice area groups. Marco also regularly assists with matters under the real estate, action, sports, business, and litigation practice groups. As the founder and executive director of the Coastal Environmental Rights Foundation, Marco is at the core of activist attorneys taking on high-profile and publicly controversial matters related to climate change, adaptation, water supply, and desalinization, among other matters. Politically, Marco advises progressive candidates and elected officials on environmental and campaign issues at the local, regional, and state levels. Molly Woods Drake moved to Encinitas in 2014, and she currently lives in Leucadia with her husband, Aaron. She's the daughter of two labor organizers who met while working for United Farm Workers. Molly was raised in a family that promoted the values of equality, justice, and compassion. Molly, alongside other Encinitas community members, founded the nonprofit Encinitas for Equality in June of 2020 following the murder of George Floyd. The mission of E4E is to educate, organize, and mobilize our communities to disassemble structural racism and oppression through solidarity and service. Molly loves to be a part of a community of like-minded neighbors and who share similar values and visions for Encinitas and our world at large. Molly was also on the Encinitas Equity Committee, a group that was formed in 2021 that provided recommendations to city government on ways in which Encinitas officials could work to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion at all levels of governance. On the far left here, we have Garvin Walsh, a financial advisor and a longtime resident. Now, Garvin is a resident of Encinitas for the past 5 years or so. He's now retired. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and graduated from Georgetown University. He had a 30-year career on Wall Street in the institutional equity business. He was involved in local politics back east, including a successful stint of the Open Space Advisory Committee. He's an observer and frequent commentator about local affairs in Encinitas. And now that the Guardians have lost out to the Yankees, apparently he's become a Padres fan. So thank you all for coming on the show. Really appreciate everyone's time here. We'll get right into the issues. So we got a number of requests for topics ranging from housing, homelessness, education, and we're going to start right off the top with one of the sort of hot issues of the day, which is a local controversy concerning the Encinitas Unified School District. Now, as our community members may know, there was a Halloween party that was hosted by that is going to be hosted on October 29th by the school, or actually was advertised by the school, but it's not directly hosted by the school. But anyways, there was a controversy over the contents of the show and its relation to children and parents, and it actually even got on Fox News and NBC as well. So I just want to start off by asking you, Molly, what you think of the way that the school district handled this situation and sort of what you think could have been done differently.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the first thing that's really important to note is that this is being hosted by Trans Family Support Services, a nonprofit that leads on supporting our transgender families, youth throughout San Diego. And so Trans Family Support Services has a memorandum of understanding with EUSD, which is why they were able to have the flyer in the peach jar, which for folks that aren't familiar with that, it's a email blast that goes out to only parents or guardians that submit their emails in the district. And so that email went out with countless other invitations and opportunities for families to get involved in things that the school was letting people know is happening. This includes Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, YMCA events, and all sorts of things. And so I think that the district did an incredible job by being inclusive and making sure that families that are part of the LGBT community know that there are opportunities for them as well that are taking place in San Diego. I think the point of contention ended up being that it was advertised that the sponsors are both a surgical realignment center as well as a bar that's in Hillcrest. And the policies of EUSD is to not solicit anything that has to do with alcohol. And so that is why my understanding is that they took it down. I think EUSD, both Superintendent Andre Gray as well as the board, have done an incredible job of standing united with our LGBT students and families by not pandering to really hateful people within this community that have called members of that board groomers, pedophiles, and other really atrocious things that we shouldn't be saying about our neighbors. And so I stand united with our LGBT families. If I were in town, I would be joining the Boo Bash, and I encourage people to go and understand more about our LGBT, specifically our trans families.
Sure, thank you. So Garvin, I'm going to turn to you. So out of all that was said, again, how do you think the situation was handled, and what, in your view, like on a broader level in terms of education, is sort of the correct balance between respecting and affirming LGBTQ plus members of our community while also balancing, say, parental sensitivities and those sorts of issues?
My understanding of the EUSD issue is a little bit different than Molly's. I think the core objection was that the facilities of the school, the network, the Peachtree network, were used in violation of their own communications guidelines. And whether that's true or not, I understood that to be the accusation. More generally, I do understand why parents are pushing back against the intrusion into the schools and the curriculum of the sexualization of youth. My children are fully grown, and I'm actually a grandfather now, so I don't have to contend with these problems myself. But in my opinion, we have a couple things going on in this general discussion about sexual orientation and school policy. One is that the class of individuals who, well, let me back up for a second. Let me articulate my own view of how we ought to treat people in school and in general. I think that it's probably difficult enough to be gay or transgender or confused. It's difficult enough, especially in adolescence, which is difficult to begin with. It's difficult enough to go through life struggling with those issues yourself. So I am not a fan of any institutional or individual persecution of people that see themselves that way. And my philosophy is that the schools should embrace a pretty simple, straightforward premise, that we should treat others the way we want to be treated ourselves. We all know that as the golden rule, but I discovered not that long ago that some version of that has been characteristic of societies around the world for thousands of years. And it makes perfect sense. So you gotta go along to get along. So I think school policy towards individuals in their school, not only regarding sexual orientation questions, but in general, should keep that in mind. I think the problem for many parents is that the institutional, the sort of educational establishment appears to be making an attempt to institutionalize a point of view about these issues. And clearly, families have different opinions and should be entitled to, process those issues themselves internally. I find it, in California for sure, and probably in most states of the union, the age of consent for participation, legal participation in sex, is 18 years of age. I find it very odd that our schools are engaging with students in teaching and practices, that could be seen as proselytizing for a point of view long prior to the age of 18. Yes, kids do experiment with sex in school, and there's nothing we can do about that. But promoting that experimentation doesn't seem to me to be a good idea. And I don't know the extent to which that's true, but I understand that to be part of the complaint from people. Okay. As I said, thank God I'm not going through it myself.
Yeah. Thanks, Aaron.
I want to make a little bit of
Go ahead.
A comment. I think today I'm going to make multiple comments about context. And I think it's important to take a step back, as you always have to, and look at the intersection of this issue with and the people involved in this issue with the other two big educational issues that we see nationally: CRT and anti-CRT activism, critical race theory issues, and the Let Them Breathe crowd here in San Diego. And I think what you're going to find is the same leadership, the same people who were front and center on the Let Them Breathe, anti-masking, kind of anti-government, very right-leaning, are at the same forefront of this hullabaloo, this blow up of this issue regarding LGBTQIA. And then when you take a step further back and you look nationally, you have to contextualize what's happening right here in Encinitas with what's happening in Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill, with the heightened level of fear-based propaganda around social issues like immigration. So I think what you see is on the right a very targeted, intentional campaign to vilify establishment, left-leaning government entities. And we've seen from the Republican Party itself, they straight up said, our doorway into local politics is through the school boards. And they have fundraised around it. They have shown up all over the country doing book bannings, making this attack on LGBTQIA and transgender people generally as kind of a big issue. And that's something that we see happen every few years when they're losing on the real issues of the economy and on just politics in general. They default back to kind of a hate-based, fear-based, nationalistic, let's define people as other and attack them and attack their supporters. And I don't see what's happening here as being any different than what we're seeing happening nationally. And frankly, it's just the sheer inability to distinguish between the concepts of gender and sexual identity and sex. This notion that people are groomers or sexualizing. I mean, look, nationally, it's straight white men who are the problem when it comes to child porn, grooming. I mean, and it's largely on the right, frankly. But to come in and say that a family-friendly drag show is somehow sexualizing people, what they're essentially saying is that any attempt to normalize tolerance is, as was being characterized by Garvin here, as somehow advocating. And those are just separate things. We have intellectually dumbed down the discussion so that the right can appeal to people who want to see as other and want to gain a foothold politically. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Garvin, any rebuttal?
Thanks. I would say that, first of all, what Marco had to say for himself, I think, is useful for the audience to hear without comment from me, because they can assess what he had to say himself. He did make a comment that I thought was interesting. He referred to the left-leaning educational establishment, but the premise of his comment is that he's sort of dismayed at a pushback from the right against a left-leaning educational establishment. I see politics and even culture as part of a dialectical process. The left and right, the yin and yang, yin and yang, they encounter each other and sparks fly and something emerges from that that's neither. And I think it's perfectly natural to me that there'd be pushback when we have a situation that some people regard as advocacy. As I said, I think the appropriate policy should be tolerance toward individuals and not advocacy for groups.
Okay. Before we move on from this topic, Molly, final thoughts?
Yeah, I just again want to say that it's really important to note that this email went to parents. It did not go to children. And so the idea that children were being made aware, and I particularly think that, yes, we should let children know that this is happening. But this went to parents. If parents don't, and guardians, if they don't want their children to know that there's a Boo Bash event going on with a family-friendly drag show, they had the ability to hit delete. Children know what is going on now because they made a huge deal about this flyer going out in an email. And I also just want to talk again, Garvin mentioned the sexualization of children by a family-friendly drag show. The origin of drag came from Shakespearean days when women could not participate in acting, and so men dressed up in women costumes and they dragged their dresses across the stage. Had nothing to do with sex. It had nothing to do with sexualizing anyone. Later, drag became a place where people could really own and celebrate who they were. Whether it was men dressing up as women and wearing makeup, it was people really owning and celebrating who they are. Why wouldn't we want our children to own and celebrate who they are? It has nothing to do with sexualizing. I think the hypocrisy that's coming from the people that are speaking out about this, people who have been former beauty pageants and flaunt on a stage wearing a bathing suit, people that, go to football games where cheerleaders are grinding on the ground. If we have issues with sexualizing, let's talk about all of it. But it doesn't begin with a family-friendly drag show. And I just think we should be very clear, to Marco's point, of who's pushing this. It's people that were anti-mask, people that homeschool their children, people that don't actually live in the district, and people who they themselves sexualize themselves by creating sex tapes when they were underage. And so we should talk about, it's like sexualizing children and who's entering our boardrooms and making these comments.
Sure. Thanks.
Steve, I just would like to mention that I think it would be it's a stretch to believe that this enterprise is not about sexualizing children, but I'd leave your audience to judge that for themselves and to assess Molly's comments themselves.
If I could, I would love to have someone, because I've really been wanting someone to expand on how a family-friendly drag show is sexualizing children, and so I would love, Garvin, for you to actually expand on how that's happening. What is it about the drag show that sexualizes children or leads to grooming?
I don't think the drag, while you're correct that men portrayed women on stage not only 500 years ago, but in my lifetime, since I attended a boys' school, while that's true, it wasn't about sex. It was about the role and the script. And my limited exposure to drag queens, if I can use that expression, and there's one or two of them I think that have achieved a great deal of renown and fame, Hollywood celebrity and whatnot. It's clear to me that the subject of their expressiveness is sexuality. That's just an observation. What the ideology is behind that, I can only speculate.
So the difficulty is burlesque, right? I think in the common vernacular, drag queens are gay men who dress up as women and do burlesque content performances, shows. And there's certainly an element of drag in the 70s and whatnot that focus on that. But when you get into modern times, when you get into modern acceptance, that tolerance, that children oftentimes are gender nonconforming or know that they are elsewhere on the traditional binary kind of spectrum, we have things like library-sponsored reading by drag queens. You go to one of those and they're not in super skimpy clothes. There's not raunchy music. They're literally just creating an image that, hey, this person might be a little bit different, just like you might be a little bit different. But this person sits up here and gives you an engaging, totally age-appropriate show that you walk away from going, that guy was funny, or that woman was funny and she read us a story. And parents, the kids have no idea. The kids come away going, yeah, it's cool. I feel like we're all just here having a good time. And it's the parents who come in with their own presumption of behavior or their presumption of problems. I think it's the parents who have the problem, frankly. These kids aren't coming away saying, oh, this makes me want to dress in drag. They might come away saying, this makes me feel a little better about telling my mom that I like Disney princesses and I'm a boy, or that I don't understand why people tell me I can't like the color pink and I'm a boy. I think that's the type of inclusiveness and tolerance that gets preached by the family-friendly drag, as opposed to, I'm a boy who wants to wear G-strings to school and ask people to put dollar bills in it. It's just not, it's apples and oranges, and it's frustrating as an ally to the LGBTQI community to have to fight on the most basic level of kind of intelligence and call BS on what's being put out there by frankly, the right-wing folks who are yelling the loudest.
Well, I appreciate you being forthcoming and explaining your views. I just would say that my kind of hesitancy and conservatism and difficulty in embracing your mentality I think is probably more in tune with what most people feel than your views are. But, that's just speculation on my part.
I want to talk about a related issue, which is in education. There's been some controversy lately over kind of sort of the role of labor unions when it comes to involvements in things such as school boards, local political functions, especially in Encinitas, the Encinitas Unified School District. There's this whole discourse over the union-backed candidates versus the non-union-backed candidates. And I just want to know, when it comes to this conversation, and Mark, I'll start with you, whether you believe that labor unions locally are being unjustly vilified for their involvement in local politics, especially when it comes to education.
Yeah, I mean, look, to the extent that I am unabashedly partisan, I'm also unabashedly pro-labor. I think people know that my sister is the head of the California Labor Federation, and at one point she was secretary-treasurer of the San Diego County Labor Council. I come from a family that essentially believes that there is nothing bad about labor unions. In fact, we point to all the benefits that society has received from the labor movement over the years. That being said, specific to our lives here in Encinitas, I also know that for years, with a relatively harmonious school board at both the USD and SD, San Diego Union High School District, we have seen our district maintain status as the best in the region. And to come in now and say that that was somehow bad, and to pick out reasons, that the struggles with economics that every district has is a reason why we should be moving away from a strong working relationship between the teachers unions and the board, I think is absurd. I think the only thing we've seen in the shift over the last couple of years away from a strongly cohesive union-backed board is discord. Discord that's been bad for the students, discord that's been bad for the schools, and bad for the community. I don't think that the trustees that have held themselves up as being anti-union have done the district any favors whatsoever. And so, the union are the teachers. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was running around and heralding them as heroes, and realizing that as parents, we suck doing their job, trying to do teaching from home. Most of us just can't do it. We have other things. We rely on teachers to raise our children. And then to turn around and say that, the labor union has too much of a say in how our curriculum, how our district is run, I just think it's absurd. And again, it comes back to that same thing that I talked about earlier. It's anti-labor, right-wing focus, trying to take over an aspect of politics as an entree into next-level power.
Garvin, do you think that labor unions at the local level have too much sway in politics, especially when it comes to things like the school board?
Well, yes, I do, but doesn't mean I'm anti-union. I mean, the union has a job to advocate zealously, I think, for the interests of their members, and they do that. As to the school board, I think the trustees have a different job, which is to advocate for the interests as they see them of students, parents, and in my view, even those who aren't directly involved with the schools, taxpayers and voters more generally. So yeah, I think they have a presence. Marco referred to the economic difficulties of San Diego's school district as not unlike what others experience. I don't know what everybody else experiences. I do know that for 7 years the school district has been getting letters from the county saying, you're out of line, you're trending the wrong way. We've seen our reserves deteriorate year in and year out. So there is an economic issue. We've got a cadre, a cohort of teachers who are the highest paid in the district and actually have a contract feature that was negotiated between the union and a board controlled by their trustees, or a board populated by trustees they control, which provides for a reset of their compensation schedule if another district, God knows where, bumps up above them. So they are they have by contract are going to be the highest paid teachers in the region. Good for them, not so good for everybody else. The discord, I agree with Marco 100%. The discord has been very disruptive and unpleasant, and it doesn't reflect well on anybody. But in my opinion, based on the observation of events, it began when Michael Allman was elected in 2020, converting the balance on the board from 2-3 Republican Democrat to 3-2 Republican Democrat. So once the union lost control in 2020, the discord began. They've been attacking on numerous fronts, and I think you got to connect those dots to make a realistic assessment of what's going on. In my opinion, there's just no good reason to have union-controlled trustees sitting on the other side of the table from the union. And it matters not just at contract renewal time, it matters throughout the year when issues pertaining to the curriculum arise and which issues pertaining to the administration of the district arise. The independence of the trustees, in my view, is an important ingredient to the correct operation of the district, and the union would like it to be otherwise.
Sure.
Separately, I'd say that we don't have private sector unions that I'm aware of operating in Encinitas. We don't have, unionized industries. There may be unions at the Ford dealership or something. I don't know, but for the most part, we're talking about public sector unions, and without vilifying them, which isn't a term I would have used, I would say it's kind of another example of the same phenomenon where you have politicians, the party politics in California and in Encinitas for the last several years has been dominated by the Democratic Party. In my observation, they're in close alignment with the interests of the union, and there's a symbiosis going on there that probably doesn't work to the advantage of the rest of us.
Sure. Molly, I want to turn to you. So do you find the influence of unions at school boards, at these local institutions in Encinitas, do you find that problematic, as Garvin said?
Yeah, so before I answer that, it's rare that Garvin and I agree on something, and I heard him say that the discord began at Santa Guido Unified High School District when Michael Allman was elected, and I agree with you on that. And so, one, I wanted to put that out there. Two, I also want to say, for transparency purposes, I work for a labor union. I work for Service Employees International Union. We represent close to 2 million union workers across the country, and I've worked for labor unions for the last 12 years. So what I'm saying is not from my professional opinion, but it's from my own personal. So I just want to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of my labor union. And with that, I do have a lot of experience in unions. And what I'll say is unions are absolutely under attack here in our backyard, here in the school board, but they've been under attack for decades across the country. And this is because workers, when they come together and collectively create power to fight for their own rights and advocate for what they believe in, specifically for teachers' unions, they don't just advocate for themselves as teachers. One of their number one things they advocate for is their students, and they do that by advocating for smaller class sizes. And so I think it's extremely important that we have trustees on the board that support our teachers, who Marco said, like, the teachers are the union. The union isn't this third-party entity that comes and sweeps in and gives a bunch of money to trustees and then says, vote the way we want. That money comes from teachers deciding and electing to contribute to their dues and often to a political fund separately. And those teachers have the right to do so through collective bargaining and as being a union member. And then that's who they decide to elect, because that they know that those are the people that are going to advocate for teachers, who are going to advocate for students. Prior to working directly for SEIU, I worked for healthcare workers, and I represented healthcare workers at Tri-City Medical Center. They have a board that's elected as well. The hospital workers at that hospital would always decide to support candidates that were going to be labor friendly, that were going to say, we're going to fight on behalf of healthcare workers. Why wouldn't we want the people that are sitting on boards and making decisions to advocate on behalf of healthcare workers or firefighters or teachers, to the people that are providing the service that educates our children, takes care of our patients, take care of our communities. I don't hear people complaining about who the police union endorses. I don't hear people complaining about who the firefighters endorse. And yet when it comes to teachers, there is so much noise going on, and it goes back to what Marco said earlier. School boards are the entry point for the right wing, for MAGA supporters to enter into politics and move their way up the ranks. It is also the place where they're trying to change history. It's like have transparency of curriculum, which is actually controlling curriculum, banning books, and making sure that our students and our youth in the future of this country don't receive the type of education that they should have to be part of a multicultural country. And so I think that absolutely unions are being vilified. I support all of our union-backed candidates for San Diego Unified as well as EUSD, and I encourage others to as well, because if you support teachers, you're going to support who they want to sit at the table and make decisions on behalf of them as well as on behalf of our students. And I'll say, it's like when Garvin mentioned this is who our trustees are here on behalf of, he forgot to say teachers. Our trustees absolutely have a responsibility to sit there and make decisions, not just on behalf of teachers, but on behalf of all staff and administrators that work within. That's part of their budget. That's part of their job. And I'll close with this. There's people that talk about being independent candidates. I started by saying I believe that the problems began at San Diego Unified High School District when Almond was brought onto the board. He claims to be an independent candidate, yet on his own website, he allowed people, if they paid $5,000 to his campaign, to have a seat in his internal advisors. So if I gave him $5,000, I would get to have a seat and tell Almond how to vote. What makes him any different than getting money from the union? There is no one that is truly independent. They're receiving money from PACs in every area. The union just happens to be the one that's the most transparent about it.
Sure. Garvin, and I do want to move on to this topic, but I want to get your thoughts on, Molly made an interesting point to do with sort of this cultural conflict in schools that's unfolding. And I know we're kind of getting outside the local arena, but I think it's relevant for Encinitas as well. Do you think that there's any truth to this sort of suggestion that the right, the conservatives, are sort of using school boards and schools as sort of this entry point for conservative thinking, whether it's history books, whether it's the issues that we discussed earlier with LGBTQ plus students and that sort of thing? Do you feel like it's kind of this entry point for conservatives to sort of advance an agenda in opposition to a different agenda, or what do you make sort of that cultural war discourse in our schools?
May I, before I answer that question, respond just briefly to something Molly said? Molly mentioned that the unions have been under attack for decades. I think it's true that union membership has been declining in great part for decades. There has been growth. The only area of growth in the union ranks is in the public sector employees. And the places where those employees are concentrated are the cities, where lots of people live and where lots of workers congregate. And those cities are, by and large, controlled by, as we know all around the country, democratic political teams, if I can use that expression. So they've made gains on friendly turf. And in the private sector, auto workers or, electricians or whatever the case might be, membership is declining. Not because they're being attacked, but because they don't have the same organizing advantages that the public sector has. They're dealing with the trustees, the board members of the companies that they're working for who have opposing interests, whereas the public sector people are dealing with politicians sitting across the table from them who have interests that are somewhat aligned. So to answer your question about the cultural confrontation, I think it's true that there is a cultural confrontation taking place, but I think what's happening is, I think it's far more fundamental than the fight over the Boo Bash or something like that. I think what's happening is that we're seeing the emergence of a sort of political strategy that essentially adds up to assembling a sort of a coalition or a condominium of grievance-based interest groups. And that to me is somewhat what defines the Democratic Party these days. But the point is that historically in our political culture, from the time of our founding, and for 1,000 years really in English common law history, we haven't really thought of groups as having rights that were special. And we've tried, and certainly in this country, to respect the individual rights and responsibilities. What's happening here, and I think what is underpinning all of these so-called cultural battles, is a battle over group rights versus, wait a minute, we're just a bunch of individuals, let's make rules that apply to everybody. So I think, I'm just looking at it very fundamentally, I think that's what's going on.
Okay. So I need to provide a little bit of context. First of all, I think, for lack of a better word, it's comical to consider that the left or the Democrats are the grievance-based groups when kind of the victim mentality that has exploded since 2016 when Trump came in. I mean, geez, like, talk about the grievance and victimhoods. But context. Growing up here, growing up in North County, forever, Encinitas has been a bastion of liberalness in a sea of conservatism. Now, as a region bounded by MCRD and the naval base at North Island and Camp Pendleton, we have evolved as a relatively conservative, Republican-based community. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the city of San Diego first elected a Democratic majority city council. It wasn't until just a couple years ago that the San Diego County Board of Supervisors elected its first Democratic majority. But Encinitas, largely by virtue of the presence of SRF and frankly the hippie culture that came here in the 60s, has been a bastion of liberal politics, surrounded by places like Vista, San Marcos, Escondido, even Carlsbad and Del Mar. And what we've seen is regionally an increase in liberal power beyond just Encinitas. But as that's happened, we always had kind of Chula Vista and National City, and then as the other areas became more diverse, or as the political whims of voters shifted in San Diego, it coincided with property value increases in Encinitas. As Encinitas became more akin to Del Mar and Solana Beach in terms of what it costs to live here, the people coming in and bringing money into Encinitas were more right-leaning than historically. And so what we've seen is a clash, and it's at all levels, from the school board and to city council. And we saw this, with a period of Kristen Gaspar, Jerome Stocks, Dan Gallagher, James Bond on the city council. We saw an influx of Republican rhetoric of right-leaning folks feeling like Encinitas was a place where they could have a bigger fight than historically, where kind of the region said, Encinitas is always going to be liberal. And so when we look to why is Encinitas becoming kind of the forefront of a lot of these discussions, it greatly affects our discussion on housing, but I think it's reached a point where it also greatly affects our discussion on school boards. The rise of moneyed interests in La Costa, Olivenhain, and the city of Encinitas generally is the reason why we have more Republicans. More Republicans living in the city means we're going to have more of these conflicts.
Yeah, sure. I want to move on to and shift gears a bit. So, Molly, I want to start with you. You mentioned in an informal conversation we had before that, because we recorded an episode of this podcast last week between mayoral candidates Cindy Cremona and Tony Kranz, and one of the topics that came up there, of course, was homelessness as well as crime. And you felt as though in that conversation that those two topics were perhaps unjustly conflated by at least one of the candidates. And I just want to start on this huge topic by starting out with sort of letting you clarify that position. Like, what do you think is, in terms of this misperception, in your opinion, of crime and homelessness, and why do you think those should be two separate issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I thank you for bringing on both candidates, Cindy Cremona and Tony Kranz. And I took the time to listen to it. And one of the things that Cindy talked about was that she had gone on a ride-along with sheriffs and every call they got had to do with homeless, was somebody who was homeless. And so I think it's really important for people to know being homeless is not a crime. And so when Cindy is talking about the rise of crime in Encinitas, and then says every call that we're getting to respond to a crime is someone who's homeless, she's virtually saying that being homeless is a crime. Yeah. She doesn't talk about what happened on those calls. Was somebody sleeping in front of a store? Was somebody sleeping in a park? All of these things aren't a crime. And so I think it's really important that we look at our neighbors who I have relationships with many of them because Encinitas for Equality hosts last Saturday of the month. We partner with Humanity Showers and we have our unhoused neighbors come take showers, have a hot breakfast, and I have the opportunity to hear their stories. Many of these people were housed in Encinitas. COVID happened. They weren't able to make ends meet, pay their bills, and they ended up on the streets. These aren't people that heard about a safe parking lot program, bought a bus ticket without a car, and moved to Encinitas to try to stay in a safe parking lot program that requires you to have a car to sleep in. And so I think criminalizing homelessness creates a story that really fits the narrative of right-leaning candidates that want to induce fear in our community. Our homeless community, for the most part, maybe some of them are suffering from mental health issues, maybe some of them are suffering from addiction, but they're not criminals and they're not looking to commit crimes here. Crime, on the other hand, increased like it has increased most everywhere in the country during COVID. There were acts of desperation occurring by most everyone. I don't often watch Bill Maher, but I watched him last night, and he talked about the fact that crime was up, car accidents were up, all of the things that we tried to reduce were up during COVID and the pandemic because of the way that people were responding to a situation that they're not normally familiar with. My understanding is that the top crime that occurs in Encinitas is shoplifting and people breaking into cars. And so I don't think that this is happening necessarily by our homeless community, but just by people who might be down on their luck and are looking for a quick way to, it's like, rob a car, go somewhere else. Cindy also mentioned that the car theft and what was happening was from gangs from Central America or South America. That's not our homeless population. And so I think that we have to have a conversation about the two very separately. I also want to say that homelessness, when you look at the statistics, and people say homelessness went up by, I believe, Julie Thunder said 64% since, the last point of count. Numbers matter. Our last point in time count, which I participated in, was approximately 126 unhoused people living in Encinitas. Prior to that, it was around maybe 40, 50, but prior to that, the years prior, it was all in the same, if not higher. It was 130, it was 118, it was 120. Our unhoused population has largely stayed the same for the last 5-6 years in Encinitas, and this idea that it's gone up under Mayor Catherine Blakespear and the certain council, those are lies. Statistics matter. Other mayor candidate Jeff Morris has said, I don't care about the stats. I don't want to look at that. Facts matter, especially when we're talking about things like homelessness, crime, that could clearly be tracked. And so I would really hope that people at home that are paying attention, that are watching debates, actually look at the numbers, they look at facts, and they look to people that are going to look at facts and make solutions based on those.
Sure. Mark, I want to turn to you real quick. The conversation yesterday that I had with Michael Blow and Jeff Morris, I asked them this question, which is homelessness solutions tend to be based around two sort of camps, not always, and there's crossover, but sort of this camp of people who believe that this is an issue of affordable housing, and then you have people who believe that this is driven by mental illness, substance abuse, that sort of thing, and that's kind of the camp that they fell into. And I just want to know, like, where sort of you stand, like in Encinitas specifically, our homelessness problem, or our homelessness, how we're dealing with our unhoused population, like, is this more of a question of affordable housing, or is this more of a question of we need to tackle these more underlying factors?
So I think there's a difference between talking about causes and solutions, right? So on the cause side, what is causing people to be homeless? Clearly, we have had an opioid crisis in our country. We have had addiction issues throughout our country that have been off the charts. We have also had a legacy of recession in the last 20 years as a result of the 2007 to 2009 downturn that created, or that was also the result of, a renewed interest in real estate as investment. And anytime you get that shift in real estate where you start seeing the corporatization of our housing market, the rise of Airbnb and VRBO, the volatility of the stock market causing people to take their cash out and put it into more stable real estate, it becomes this perfect storm of higher prices, and then layer on kind of hyper regulation, you have lower inventory. So from a cause standpoint, you've obviously are always going to have those people who, because of addiction or mental health problems, they find themselves out on the street. But then you also have people who are simply being priced out of the markets where they grew up. And I know the response a lot of time is, well, they should just move someplace where they can afford. But the logistics and the reality of that is it's just not realistic. It's not realistic to turn to a person who has some semblance of a support network, let's say in Encinitas, and say, oh, you really should be living in El Cajon, right? And this is one of the things that frustrates me the most when you get to the solution side. Because when a person becomes homeless, including here in Encinitas, a person who grew up here in Encinitas, a person who fell into drugs, a person who lost their job or had a medical injury that made them unable to make their rent, if this is the place that they're from, if this is a place where they kind of learn to know where they can go to the bathroom or get a shower or get a meal, to turn to them and say, the solution for you is to move you to some homeless service facility well outside of this community, is to not understand the trauma that that person has gone through to even get to the streets and then to get to a place where they can survive on the streets. When we start talking about housing as a solution to homelessness, we have to look at what actually works. It's not just housing first. The housing first model is get housing with services, what we call wraparound services. That's not, that mean, call it transitional housing, but it's really permanent supportive housing. That means that you're providing housing that has on-site mental health, on-site medical, on-site child care, on-site job skills and occupational health training. All of these things need to be wrapped up together in order for us to credibly address the issue. But the thing is, we're not even really to solutions, because we're still having this debate over whether the provision of services at the triage level is somehow exacerbating or attracting or creating more homelessness. Like, you see what I mean? Like, we can talk about solutions all day long, but the reality is the discord of discourse that we're having right now in the community is about whether CRC and groups like them should be here, about whether we should build a homeless shelter. Those are like the base level triage for the most needy of our homeless communities. We're not even talking about how we fix the problem.
Sure. Garvin, I want to turn to you and circle back to the original question I asked Molly, which is, do you believe that the issues of homelessness and crime in Encinitas are sort of unfairly conflated? And then secondly, what do you feel like in terms of city leadership is sort of the current state of solutions, and what could we be doing differently?
What was that last bit about city leadership?
Yeah, just like what could city leaders be doing differently that we aren't doing now in terms of tackling homelessness?
So are the two issues unfairly conflated? No, I don't think they are unfairly conflated. I think they are conflated somewhat because they are occurring. The rise in both categories of dysfunction are manifesting simultaneously. Correlation is not causation, I recognize, but it warrants investigation. And we've seen much stronger. We've been seeing sharp growth in the crime count over the last couple of years. I think the numbers, if I recall correctly, were like 54% and then 31%, well above what neighboring communities were experiencing. Most recently, at mid-year point this year, we've seen a rollover perhaps start to occur, down 3%. In my thinking, that's kind of a rounding error compared to 54 and 31, and it's not a trend yet, but it certainly suggests maybe we're getting it under control. And I do believe the sheriff's department is being more proactive, but there are law enforcement related issues that have to do with prosecution, et cetera. So are they connected? Yeah. Are they are politicians using these issues to induce fear, as Molly suggested? No, I think politicians are responding to expressions of fear and listening to the community and noticing that, people are worried. Now, maybe, an anecdote, an individual person's experience with a disagreeable character isn't data, I realize, but if it happens often enough, if those anecdotes add up and people start to get the impression that things have changed. So, I don't think the connection is unfairly drawn. As for what the politicians are doing, I'd say two things. One, a couple of years ago, they passed the Homeless Action Plan, which I read thoroughly. It's been a while, but I was struck by how the plan, which mostly talked about getting a staffer and putting money out into the community and the homeless parking lot and so on and so forth, it didn't actually acknowledge or include any plan to sort of address the issues of mental illness and drug abuse, which are endemic in the homeless community. And so having a homeless action plan that doesn't address what to do about that portion of that community doesn't seem to me like a great plan. My understanding, because there have been public remarks said about this by Tony Kranz, who's running for mayor and who was part of the group that passed the Homeless Action Plan. My understanding is that it's his intention to revisit that plan. He said it on the debate. Revisit that and, see what, give it a sort of a checkup and see how we're doing. And I suspect that'll be an interesting discussion, and maybe the direction will change. The homeless parking lot, to me, doesn't seem to be a big point of controversy. The way it was done and where it was placed might be controversial with good reason, but we're not. I acknowledge Molly's point that if you're homeless and have a car and a license and insurance and a registration, you're not the worst. You're not in the lowest tier of the homeless community. And according to the city, a fair number of those people are able to move on up, find permanent housing, and get it. So I don't see the parking lot as a problem per se. It may be part of the solution. Okay. Marco referenced the triage concept as being an attraction. I don't have a real strong view on that, but I do think that in some way, in some measure, the Homeless Action Plan that depends heavily on funding those channels, you could read it as, okay, how do we maintain this problem? In my view, the long-term solution should consist of a couple of ingredients. One, I think we should bend over backwards and roll out the red carpet for those of our brothers and sisters in Encinitas who experience homeless, who fall into homelessness principally because of an economic problem of one sort or another. We should really work hard to help those people, going further south. The others, I think we need to find the people that are keen to embrace the services that are offered and move on up and help them. And the ones that aren't, they're more problematic because as the law reads now, after Martin v. Boise, they are breaking the law, by defecating on the streets and sleeping in doorways. Though that is against the law in Encinitas, but we can't prosecute them because of Martin v. Boise. So, it's problematic, but it seems to me at the end of the day, the city's got to solve their problem with Martin v. Boise. In other words, find a place to offer establish the ability to offer shelter, temporary or otherwise, not temporary shelter, to people that would otherwise be sleeping on the streets. So get them off the streets, and then get them on a ramp into the custody or the services of the county, which is where the services for mental illness and drug abuse, et cetera, actually reside. We don't have that ability in Encinitas.
Yeah. Well, I want to turn to you for a closing thought on this, and I want to talk about housing and density. There's this sort of perception by some, and you may not agree, but there's a perception by some that Encinitas is sort of this sanctuary city for the homeless, and that it's sort of become, the safe parking lot program, especially this perception that, Encinitas is sort of attracting homelessness from other communities as well. And I just want to allow you to speak to that and just kind of also sort of the direction you think that our current city government has sort of taken the city in terms of, the homeless action plan and, finding solutions.
Yeah, I don't believe that Encinitas has placed itself as the sanctuary city. I'm actually good friends with a woman named Vanessa who runs Oceanside Homeless Resource Center, and I would think, honestly, if in North County, if there is a place that has the most services for unhoused community members in North County, Oceanside is one of those places. They have Brother Beano's, they have Oceanside Homeless Resource Center, they have countless services where they actually have shelters so that people can go and stay there. Encinitas happens to be where the CRC is located, and we happen to be the only safe parking lot program in North County. I don't think those two programs have created this beacon of hope for unhoused people to come here. With that said, I do think that our city council have created a compassionate city where they aren't going to, vilify the unhoused. And, it's like, well, Oceanside has some really incredible organizations. Their council has not necessarily been compassionate to the unhoused people that work there. And so I think that there's a difference between services that are provided and just the values that we represent as a city of being compassionate and trying to seek solutions without vilifying people for being homeless. And I also agree with Garvin in that the solution is multifaceted. There needs to be different approaches for different people. I am not quiet about the fact that I am someone who's been in long-term recovery. I got sober when I was 19. I very likely could have been someone that was homeless. And I would have very much appreciated people not vilifying me and instead coming with a compassionate approach and saying, like, do you want services for us to help you? I think that when it comes to mental health and addiction, it is a lot more complicated than saying, the city putting in their homeless action plan that we have services. Garvin's correct. That's where the county needs to step in because it is so extremely complicated. It's so expensive to provide health care. That's a national issue that we could talk about healthcare and how expensive it is, and then mental health becomes this whole other tier. But I think the housing first with wraparound services, I would support us having a homeless shelter here in Encinitas. Again, listening to the last podcast that you did, the solution of candidate Cremona was, this is a residential community. We shouldn't have a homeless shelter here. We should seek to send them somewhere else. I support both of what Garvin and Marco said. Like, these people, many of them are from here or they happen to have community here. We don't pick people up and move them to somewhere where they're going to be more traumatized because it helps us feel more comfortable. I think our unhoused have a problem. I don't think we have a problem with people being unhoused, and we need to start looking at it from that way. And so I would absolutely support temporary shelter here in Encinitas, domestic violence resources, mental health work with the county, which I know that we already do. I think it's really incredible that we happen to have a supervisor here that's from Encinitas that sees what's happening in our backyard and can go to the county. I briefly sat on the Behavioral Health Advisory Board for the county, and I know that there are things that are being worked out. The MCRT, the PERT, there's programs. It's such a convoluted and complicated issue that shipping people to another town isn't going to solve the problem. We need to look at it the way that our current council has been, which is with compassion, which, as Garvin shared, multifaceted approach, look at who wants to receive services and how do we prioritize getting them those, and then figure out, I agree. Recently we had an unhoused man who's been sleeping in front of Encinitas for Equality. And, it's like, I can bring him food, I could bring him meals, but at the end of the day, we have to find somewhere else for him to go because that's not a long-term solution for someone to be housed. But my first response isn't, how do I get this person out of here? How do I call the cops? It's how do we find solutions for these people that are compassionate and aren't going to re-traumatize them?
Look, and that's ultimately when you talk about the disputes around homelessness, there are people in this community who believe that there is one answer, and that is enforcement. And it's a good segue into the housing issue because essentially it's a NIMBY position, a not in my backyard position. It's our city, and some folks don't even hide it in social media. We see these comments come out from folks who don't care that they sound as atrocious as they do. They simply say, I worked hard to get into this community. This is a wealthy community. I don't want them here. Send them somewhere else. And that's just straight up NIMBYism, just like we have on housing.
Sure.
So,
I want to start with you with this next question, which is whether you stand on the side of, homelessness is driven by affordable housing, or the side of homelessness is driven by these more fundamental factors. There's no question that Encinitas in particular is becoming an extremely expensive place to live for the average person. I did a story a few months back where I interviewed a lot of longtime residents in Leucadia, for instance, who have said, they're essentially getting priced out of their own places. And you have nearly 40% of Encinitas now who are renters. And it's hard to find a place for less than $3,000 a month. So, I mean, what do you think at the local level, Marco, is sort of the correct approach to tackling this affordability crisis?
So look, again, coming back to what I started with, context, right? Having grown up here, in the 1990s, after college, I spent a lot of time. I worked here in Encinitas as, during college and a recent college grad. I worked at TCBY Yogurt, which was then in the Wiegand Plaza, kind of where Rubio's is now. And I worked at California Pizza Kitchen in Solana Beach. Formative years, home for summer from school, kind of early 90s time period. And my friends who were at UCSD and out of school for the summer, my friends who were surfers, we all lived in this community in small, affordable apartments. We weren't packed in 3 to a room, but we were in these small, affordable apartments in Cardiff, in Encinitas, in Solana Beach. There was a diversity of housing and housing price that made it feasible for us as young people to exist as we decided what we were going to do for additional school or career or whatever. Lo and behold, I come back after law school later in the 90s and then start my law firm in 2004, and I start to notice, even though I'm busting my butt to pay a good wage to my workers, both my young attorneys and my paralegals, my legal secretaries, and more they're telling me, hey, I've got to go for a while up to Oceanside or Vista to find housing, or I've got to go down to Claremont to find housing. And then it gets to the point where I simply can't find housing. I start watching the struggle. We have a lot of single moms with kids who worked for us throughout the years, and just being directly involved in that struggle, I transitioned some of my work as an environmental activist to an affordable housing activism, to try, what do I need to do to help my friends and my family and my people who work for me to get into affordable housing. And that's when I came to realize the city of Encinitas' problem with its housing element and housing policy in general. We historically have had about 19% of our total housing provided by multifamily residential, by apartments essentially. And you start looking regionally, and Sandag suggested back in 2016 when I started looking at this, that the average city in San Diego provides 44% of their housing in apartments. Now, any way you cut it, apartments may be expensive, but they're going to be less expensive than single-family residences. That's just by nature. And then when you start looking at policies that would encourage smaller units, or policies like density bonus that will encourage a higher percentage of affordable units than were required under local inclusionary requirements, that kind of light bulb went off and said, look, until as a community we provide 44, or at least the regional average of percent of our housing as low-cost rentals or lower-cost rentals, we're not doing our job to the community. We're exacerbating the problems of income inequality, of forcing the lower wage earners to commute longer from more affordable communities to service us. When I started looking around and saying, is it fair that the people who tend our lawns, the people who wash dishes in the restaurants, the people who run a yoga studio, or even the people who teach in our schools can't afford to live in and among the community that they serve? I think it's BS. From an environmental standpoint, it's forcing people to spew more greenhouse gases as they travel farther to their jobs. And just from an equity standpoint, telling people that, hey, I expect you to have to drive from Riverside County, where you can afford to live, to come and do essentially a minimum wage job in San Diego County. I just called BS on all of it. And so I jumped in, and that's, the last 10 years I've been working for affordable and multifamily housing in Encinitas because of it.
Absolutely. Garvin, I want to turn to you. There's been the housing element update projects have come under a lot of scrutiny in Encinitas, as we know, and Goodson, Clark, I could go on. But I want to ask you on the issue of affordable housing, like what in your view is sort of the correct balance of state control of these state mandates that are being pushed upon cities like Encinitas, and the balance of local control over density, over zoning, of local municipal control over how these projects fit into existing infrastructure, into existing carrying capacity. What do you think is the correct balance there, and do you think that the state as a whole is taking the right approach in these sorts of mandates that it's pushing on cities like Encinitas?
Interesting question. Before I answer it, I wonder if I could ask Marco to clarify his understanding of one point for me, kind of as a predicate for this answer. Why is the state inserting itself into the, what is the state's interest in this question? What are its purposes, as you understand them?
So I think a lot of it grows out of what we saw happen in Silicon Valley. Ultimately, even though this is something that has a much longer history, I think the money that came into San Francisco and Silicon Valley caused them to see a rise in income inequality and housing uncertainty, and then the attendant negative impacts of that. I think the folks in Sacramento looked at Sacramento and said, when it becomes so expensive to live, you both have these insanely long commutes and you have a rise in homelessness. And I think that when you start looking at, where will our graduates live? Are they going to live in our community? Are they going to leave the state because they can't find housing? I think as parents, a lot of people realize that their own kids are going to come home from college and not be able to live in the communities they grew up. But I think after what we saw happen very quickly in the late 90s, early 2000s in the Silicon Valley area, and then when we started looking at the wealthier areas, like the conversion of Venice Beach, if you will, a place that was historically affordable becoming gentrified and not affordable, the progressive elements in the state said, hey, if we don't get a handle on affordability and production of affordability, we're going to be a state of La Jolla, of Del Mar, where it's a bunch of rich old white people and no room for diversity, youth, or service workers.
I think the state is overstepped. I think it's pursuing policies that are the wrong policies, won't achieve their stated purposes. I think that we are unlikely to get to a sufficient quantity of low-income, regulated, what's the right term I should be using? Low-income housing. We're not unlikely to get a sufficient quantity of that to create the sort of ideal diversity. And we're unlikely to be able to build enough to subdue the markets independent of other economic forces, unless we build a wall around the city and prevent, if we expand supply, we won't get a result unless we reduce demand as well. So that's not going to happen. I also, as a conceptual matter, I can't think of any good reason why control of these developmental decisions should be made in Sacramento when they can be made in Encinitas or in other local communities. We have a long history in the United States and elsewhere in the West of having decisions made by people most affected to them. And the sort of origin of that instinct comes from the fact that the rights that are implicated are individual rights, not rights that are granted by the state. So let people get together, make their own decisions. In 1986, Encinitas got together and had a plan, cobbled together a city, and had a succession of general plans to grow. We're hitting the limit, and I think we're hitting the limits of those plans. Are there more opportunities to add infill housing? Probably so. But I think the question arises, Molly's talked about how much you like Encinitas as the new kid in town. Well, I'm newer than you, but and how much you'd like to have a stake here. At what point does that cease to be true? If we start building these sort of 8 and 10, 20-story towers like are going to be jammed in Bankers Hill and Santa Monica and whatnot, we start building real high-density locations around the city, we're going to kill the goose that's, we're all so attracted to. So I think there's a point where more is too much, sure. And I don't think Sacramento's in a position to make that judgment. Now, I understand, and this is where Marco has a big advantage because he's a lawyer who operates in this sphere. I understand on some level, what the law is, and I recognize that the law has put Encinitas between a rock and a hard place. We're going to have some really difficult decisions to make as the housing cycle unfolds, and so our legal options, I think, may be difficult and constrained. I don't think it's a legal question ultimately. I think it's a political question. And I think when you have cities like Encinitas that are not happy with these pressures, you have cities like Torrance, it was in the news recently, you have the local control initiative that emerged out of Redondo Beach and other areas. So you have other cities that are freaking out the way some people here in Encinitas are freaking out. And at some point that becomes enough of a political problem for our elected officials that they start to accommodate these demands. Even though the courts are saying, no, we're going to jam this down your throats, that might be what the court says because that's what the law says. It's a political problem to change the law. And I see the sort of turmoil in Encinitas as part of that political pushback. And we need to continue it and to find allies in other communities. And in my opinion, we need to support candidates that get with the program and support local control.
Sure.
Yeah, hold on. But Garvin, you don't address the core issues. Why? Why do you think the state is doing what it's doing in terms of imposing statewide regulations on that local control?
I have some thoughts about that.
But isn't it because local government has failed?
No, I don't think that's obvious. First of all, I think personally, I'm not sure when this happened because it happened before my time. But at some point, the decision was made to forestall development around the fringes of the metropolitan area. I would be inclined to believe that, if you drive out the highway to Bonsall or one of those places out towards the 15, there's a lot of empty real estate, and housing developments could go in there, and you probably could put them up for $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. Maybe I'm wrong, but certainly at lower price points. I think that could take pressure off the coastal marketplace.
Wait. So you're saying we could sprawl instead of infill?
Yeah, I think sprawl I know sprawl is a bad word. Matter of fact, about a year and a half ago, when I was reading right on the front page of the San Diego Union Tribune, they featured a guy named, I think his name was Duncan McFetridge.
My longtime client.
Okay, so you know the guy. He was a local, kind of the equivalent of a local surfer dude, except they didn't have surf in Descanso, right. Yeah. And he fought sprawl, and he won. And so, that was a long time ago.
Well, we've been filing cases for Duncan's groups for the entire 25 years that I've been practicing.
Okay, but the point is, he fought sprawl to protect the nature of his community. And as I'm reading this heroic description on the cover of the UT, he's trying to protect his community.
No, he's trying to protect nature. See, that's the difference, right? He brought those lawsuits. We brought those lawsuits with him to protect the limited critical natural resources that exist, which is very different than the lawsuits or the attempts to protect community character and people.
Well,
see the distinction?
I got to tell you, maybe I just haven't figured it. Maybe I haven't cracked the code yet, but the sort of the abundance of scrubby desert surrounding San Diego looks to me, I think there's room to spare.
Oh, Jesus.
So that's just
Mark, we can have time for a quick rebuttal, but then Molly, I want to turn to you. Margot?
Well, okay. San Diego County is a biodiversity hotspot. Recognized in the realm of ecology and conservation biology, we have a higher concentration of endangered and threatened species than almost anywhere in the United States. And around the world, there are a few places like this, like the Galapagos, where you have this because of climate and a bunch of reasons you have this. In our canyons, in our deserts, in our San Diego County backcountry, we have such a need to protect that we've had one of the first and one of the most aggressive multiple habitat conservation programs in the country. And that is a mechanism by which we balance the protection of these incredibly important habitats with the areas that the development community will get certainty to develop. And by and large, I mean, it's taken us the 25 years that I've been practicing to get to a point where we've said, okay, if we accept that we're going to have to grow, whether through in-migration or births, whatever it is, we're going to grow, we have to decide where to accommodate that growth. It becomes binary. Either you sprawl to the hinterlands, where yes, you can build housing cheaper, but you're doing it on the backs of the tax base of the metropolitan areas. Because in order to take roads, in order to take electricity, in order to build schools, fire, police, that low density development doesn't have a sufficient tax base. It essentially gets subsidized out of the urban core. And because you're disinvesting in the urban core, you create blight where you otherwise have density. And so as a community and as a state, what we've said is we're going to disincentivize sprawl on the fringe, the urban wildlife fringe and the high wildfire areas, and we're going to incentivize infill development through things like density bonus and the Housing Accountability Act. As a state, we've said that it makes more sense. Yes, we use water to build high density, but it's not the same as using water to build low density sprawl for much lesser people. It's more efficient to build in a community that already has transit than to try to take transit out to the hinterlands. And so from kind of this big picture, what we've essentially said is it's more important to protect the habitat of endangered and threatened species than protect your wealthy white version of community character. That's what it boils down to.
Marco, I think you've made a number of really good points, and I think there's an enormously valuable public debate about most of those issues that should take place. But our regional development plans, as best I can tell, weren't the product of then any kind of a debate about those issues. I don't think we've been asked to make the trade-offs between an indirect subsidy of suburban sprawl development and the density that you're talking about. I don't ever recall having those choices put to the voters. I think a more forthright explication of that point of view, countered by a competing point of view, would be a worthwhile exercise. And my observation is that as a political matter, that's been bypassed. And I think it's wrong. So I also don't think that these purposes will be accomplished. And oh, by the way, the state has been advancing these arguments based on this $3.5 million deficit for or target for increased housing by 2025. But all around us, we have plenty of evidence to suggest that that number is probably wrong. The right number is half or less than that.
Which we still won't meet.
But you make it it begs the question, when they're telling you something that you know isn't true, cui bono, who benefits? And I think you're an advocate for your clients. I appreciate that. I respect that. But the relationships that you're promoting, I think, are beneficiaries of state policy, and I think the rest of us are unlikely to be.
Well, and I'll just chime in here to say, when you ask who benefits, people like myself benefit. People like Marco's children benefit. Our parents that live in this community, they benefit from these things. And so If the idea you're trying to get at that maybe developers benefit or politicians benefit, no, it's the constituents that benefit by creating more housing, infill housing, in areas that people have created community. Community character to me, and this goes like every time someone says we're eroding the community character of Encinitas by building new development. I live on Vulcan. The Vulcan project is going to be the old, I believe it's the Masterson's florist. That's going to be the Vulcan project. To me, that wasn't community character. For probably close to several years, that's basically been a place where people dump garbage. That's not the community character of Encinitas. The community character are my neighbors. They're the people that have lived here, who have raised their families here, that work at the Lacadian, that work at Fish 101. That's the community character that I see eroding here in Encinitas. When people that run nonprofits, like Changing Tide Foundation director Becky Mendoza, who's an environmental, she's a lawyer, she's an environmentalist, when she has to move to Carlsbad because she can't afford to stay in Encinitas where she runs her nonprofit, that's the erosion of community character that we're talking about. And you mentioned, yeah, I worry. I'm a renter. I'm one of the 36% of people that live in Encinitas that builds this community character. That's a renter. And who, if tomorrow I'm told I need to move out of my place, will likely have to move to Carlsbad because I can't live in a one-bedroom apartment for $3,000. And so to me, I think this conversation is more than, it's like traffic and building a duplex next to your neighbor's McMansion. I think it's about who loses out if we don't make these decisions.
Maybe a quick final thought, and then we got to move on.
Sure. I respect what you're saying. I feel much better about whatever decision is made if it's the product of open debate and public participation rather than something that we wake up and read about in the UT.
And Marco has more history here than any of us. I moved here in 2014 and, was fortunate enough to move into a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom on Hygeia where I paid $1,600 a month. My rent has since then more than doubled, which is more mortgage than a lot of people that live here and complain about the, it's like production of housing pay. And so there is a lot of history, and there has been so much debate in the city of Encinitas around housing, around density, around affordable housing, and yet the same people keep getting elected to office. And so I think the community speaks again and again and again that we believe in, one, following the law and not ending up in multi-million-dollar lawsuits where we still ultimately will have to follow the law. Two, wanting to create housing opportunities for our seniors, which make up about 11,000 members of the Encinitas community. Housing opportunities for our children, whether they go away to college or they stay here and want to continue to work, and housing opportunities for the median age, which is 43 to 44 years old here in Encinitas. The majority of people keep voting for candidates that say, we believe in following the law and creating responsible development. And so the debate, it's been had. The result of that debate came out in 2022. Or in 2020, we're going to have another opportunity now. And I also just want to, you talk about supply and demand. One, it's like there's affordable housing and there's a percentage that will be built, not nearly enough. But then the next group is the missing middle, and we don't talk about that often enough. That's our teachers, that's our firefighters, that's our sheriffs, that's, it's like our most college graduates, they fall into that missing middle. And so they can afford a condo at Fox Point Farms. They can afford to buy a $1 million townhouse at Fox Point Farms. And we need to create avenues for our missing middle. The same, we need to create avenues for our low income. And for those that aren't aware, our low income is really anyone that's around $70,000 and below. And so these are things that we can do, and really we should do, because when people talk about the erosion of the community character, and it's going to look like La Jolla, or it's going to look like, Silicon Valley, that means it's going to look like it's all old white people. That is what will happen here. If we don't figure out avenues so that people of my generation and people of Marco's kids' generation and your kids' generation, which are mine, have the opportunity to live in Encinitas and to really create a viable future that we all love this place.
So just to put a pin in one thought, knowing we got to move on, Marco explained that the resistance to this local control mentality comes down to the view that if localities are given the opportunity to make these choices, they won't make the right choices. That's where this thing comes. My view is that we should trust localities to do that. And I think we're going to have a big debate. I hope we're going to have a big debate in 23 and 24 regarding what I expect to see the local control initiative come back to the ballot, or an attempt to bring it back. That will be an opportunity for the people of the state of California to weigh in on that. And if the debate is conducted properly at a high level and at a low level, all around, I think we might get a good decision. But without that, Encinitas has got real problems.
Yeah. I want to move to a final topic that was requested that we talk about today. So it's no secret that the last several years there's been quite a level of vitriol online in Encinitas, specifically even that you two, Marco and Molly, have been caught up in. And I think that there's a reasonable conversation to be had about kind of the state of civil dialogue politically at the local level. And I'm just curious, and I'll start with you, Marco, just with the level of hostility that we see from individuals on both sides of the aisle in Encinitas, kind of what do you think is behind that, and what are your larger thoughts on just the sort of state of civil discourse in an online forum?
I blame Trump for everything.
I second that.
I blame Hillary.
I mean, look, the reality is Trump normalized hate in so many ways in our public discourse. And I think that there are a lot of people who, let's call them the anti-woke crowd, the anti-PC crowd. There's a lot of people who don't like being told that you have to contain your hate in how you relate to people. I think there's just some people who really love the idea of going on Encinitas Undercover and being able to anonymously say the same thing that they probably say in their house, but without accountability. And then there's a lot of people who want to go into an echo chamber like Encinitas Votes and get rid of the opposition votes like they've done to Molly and I over a number of years, and simply pretend that theirs is the majority voice. People like to hear other people agree with them. And as soon as someone like me comes in with a history of having been very much on the progressive environmental and political spectrum, but then shifting to something that is perceived as less than progressive by representing multifamily developers, they want to vilify me as a greedy building industry association, money-hungry guy who hates Encinitas, who is a handler of the mayor, who pulls puppet strings. All total bullshit at the end of the day. But they want to be able to silence that, put it away, and talk about how bad people are, call them names, whether it's Newsom, Blake, Spear, Kranz, Nathan Fletcher, or my sister, Lorena Gonzalez. They want to be able to call them names and say bad things without having the accountability and pushback that comes from people like me, people like Molly on Nextdoor or other places. And, why? Because people are jerks. I think there's just a lot of people out there in particular who look at what they've accomplished and say, I worked hard to get here and I have my little slice of paradise in the pie. And there's no reason why I should have to have less of that because these guys want to provide for illegal immigrants and labor union based teachers and, low income workers. I think at the end of the day, when we have rational discussions, they lose. And the response to them losing over and over and over again is to be jerks. And frankly, Trump made it okay for them to do it.
Yeah. Molly?
Yes. So first, I will own my own fire and sometimes negativity that I bring to social media. I think there are jerks, and I think that there are people that have been in a lot of fear over the last several years. And whether it's founded fear or unfounded fear, I think that rather than admit that, rather than say it makes me uncomfortable that people are talking about race and I have to recognize my own privilege, they would rather just point fingers and try to make somebody irrelevant by disparaging them, by creating lies, and not having a healthy debate about it. I am likely not outing Garvin, but Garvin and I went to coffee because Garvin is someone who hasn't publicly put my past history on social media. He hasn't posted personal photos of me. He hasn't threatened to have a homeless person smoke me. They haven't said that they're going to pay $10,000 for me to take my sorry white A out of this town, as Mayor candidate Cindy Cremona said. There are certain people I won't sit down across the table from because the level of vitriol and the level of attacks have been so personal and inappropriate. And I think that's really in hopes of discrediting me. My sobriety, my mental health have been brought up on social media. And I am someone that I have no problem talking issues to that person. And so whether it's Garvin, whether it's any number of women who have followed me from city council meeting to school board meeting to slander me, I will go one-on-one with them on social media. But I think one of the main problems that exist is that, as Marco said, I was blocked from Encinitas votes 2.5 years ago when I said that the administrator made a racist remark. I don't have to walk with MLK to be an activist and to prove that I care about people of color. And walking with MLK doesn't protect someone from being called out for making racist remarks. And when I did that, I was kicked out of the group. Yet, my name comes up on that group, as does Marco's, more than most anybody else's in town, and I don't have the ability to defend myself. And so I think that's where the problem lies, is when people speak about you behind their back, they speak about you anonymously in these hate groups, and you don't have the opportunity to have, whether it's civil discourse or any sort of discourse, you only hear one side of a story. You only hear one narrative. And that makes people feel safe. That makes them feel like they are right. They get to live in this little echo chamber where everybody gangs up and agrees on them. And then I see these people in public. Jeff Morris, for instance, tried to shake my hand at the debate, the D3 debate. And I asked him to leave my space because I don't feel safe around these people. And so Trump, social media has created this situation where people will say and do things that they would never do face-to-face to one another. And they do it a lot behind each other's backs. I am a Spitfire. I am it's like lightning rod. I will speak up. I will call people out. But I will say it by tagging them and responding to their comments specifically. And so what I would say on social media is that if people have questions about how long I lived here, since 2014, if people have questions about how much money I have received being the president of Encinitas for Equality, $0. If they have questions about whether or not I'm going to take Tony Kranz's seat if he wins mayor, no, I don't plan to. They should just ask me. And let's have a real conversation and dialogue, and let's not hide behind blocked walls where you can say whatever you want to say that feeds a narrative that makes you sleep better at night. And let's just talk.
Garvin, so to you, what do you think about the state of discourse in Encinitas? Do you kind of agree with some of the points that have been made about, sort of these echo chambers that have been created and just the level of pure vitriol directed at people like Marco and Molly? And just final thoughts.
Dude, you too. I mean, Garvin's been on the receiving end recently on again, Encinitas Undercover mostly, but
yeah, I'm not pleased with the nature of public discourse on social media, and I agree it's an echo chamber. I have a suspicion that 200 years ago we had a version of the same. It might have been a bunch of guys standing around the general store chewing tobacco and or printing what was yellow sheets and accusing people of things they weren't guilty of. But that doesn't excuse it. And in my opinion, you kind of have to dial it out, pay attention to the people that seem to approach discussion a little more reasonably. I try to do that, but I have certainly indulged in a little dose of snark every now and then. My hope is that beyond the 50 or 100 people on Encinitas votes who are dishing out 98% of the comments, beyond them there's another 1,500 or so who are just watching and silently, and maybe, just maybe, you can communicate to them. There are some real low points. Encinitas Undercover would be the best example of that, um, locally. What to do about it? I don't know. Just, engage in the process, but try to be more civilized. I was glad to hear Molly at the beginning of her remarks owning her history. And, to be fair, Molly sort of launched herself into this community with some, really provocative rhetoric, let's just call it that way. And some of which was targeted at me. But we had an exchange online and then in person, and she seems to have. I still think she's full of baloney on a lot of things, but she seems to have decided to approach dialogue more constructively, and good for her. Marco didn't want to sit down with me and get acquainted. That's fine, but he's not uncivilized generally, at least on social media. And there have been times when I've agreed with him and said that on sort of quasi-legal issues. But I don't know what to do about it. I don't like it. I think that the absence of a mass media in a place like Encinitas is a problem for sitting politicians and office holders, I should say. And I think if they were more proactive about communicating their positions regularly and thoroughly, we'd probably be all be better off, and hopefully the new crew will be more open.
Sure. We might have time for like one quick thought, but then we got to close before the cameras die. So, Marco, Molly.
So, I'm forever hopeful in Encinitas. Having lived through, look, I sued the city in 1999 on behalf of then San Diego Baykeeper because it didn't have a stormwater program. And it was a big fight, and then some folks got elected. Sheila Cameron got elected mayor. She had been, she got elected city council, or she became, in the majority, she became mayor. It radically changed the city's willingness to settle our lawsuit and become the most forward-thinking stormwater management city in the region. And they got a lot of accolades. They got grants to build stormwater treatment facilities, a lot of things. And then, after a couple years of enjoying that, then we had the dark years where we saw the shenanigans of Jerome Stocks and James Bond and ultimately Kristen Gaspar come in. And then we saw a shift back with Teresa Barth and Tony Kranz and Lisa Schaefer. And so, much like a lot of places, we're going to see pendulum swings. But, as folks in the civil rights movement say, the bend, the arc, towards justice is pretty strong here in Encinitas. I love the fact that there's people like Molly who are here, and not just here, but they're here and they're committed intersectionally. They're not just committed to diversity or just school issues or just LGBTQIA or just environment. It's people like her. I feel people like me and the people in my law firm, my kids, my wife, people who are operating across the range of progressive issues that are going to make a big dent in the civility, in the outcomes, in maintaining the true vibe of Encinitas long term. So, I'm going to keep putting up a fight like Molly. I'm never going to shirk away from it. For every 3 people who think I'm an asshole here in the community, I got 5 people on the street coming up to me saying, hey, I don't comment, but I love what you're doing. So, I love this community. I love the people in the community. I love surfing here. I love having my business here. That's just not going to change.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for coming on. Garvin, appreciate it. Marco and Molly. I thought this was a great conversation. This has been another episode of Stay Classy San Diego with your host, Steve Wire. And again, we're sponsored by Max Lux Media and Barn Time Productions, and you can visit them at barntimemusic.com. Again, thanks to everyone for coming on, and stay tuned for more episodes. Stay classy, San Diego.